Representative Michael Veile from Soda Springs serves on the Business Committee, the Education Committee, and the Transportation and Defense Committee. He joins us this week to talk about budget cuts, the health and welfare budget, his plans for the legislative session, and for re-election. Perfect, and thank you so much for joining us today, Representative Veile. The first question that I wanted to ask you is, what's the general atmosphere been like this week in the legislature? What's some of the major bills, and what's it been like this week?
So this week, some of the major bills that are coming through are budget bills. There are a number of budget bills that are coming. We passed a number of them in the House. These bills are worked on for various agencies in the state, and they're put together by JFAC, the Joint Finance and Appropriation Committees, and they come to the House and the Senate, and we pass those. So we've had a number of those that have passed. What the tenor is of the legislature this week is there's been a lot of bills coming through. A whole bunch of bills have stacked up. And so we have been voting on an awful lot of bills each day, trying to get to the end of the legislature. We're trying to get them introduced, get them across the floor, get our House bills finished. The Senate's doing the same thing. We have a number of Senate bills that need to be taken up, and the Senate has a number of House bills to be taken up. Because if we don't pass them through both houses, they don't make it to the governor. And so that's been a lot of the tone around this week, is trying to get through all these bills that have been heard throughout the session and have stacked up, and trying to get them taken care of.
And I know that you mentioned some of the budget bills and some of those appropriations. Can you tell us, so last week there was the Senate Bill 1331 that asked for a additional 1% holdback for a total of 4% for this fiscal year, and then potentially more for the next fiscal year. And you voted in favor of that bill. Could you explain some of your reasoning and why you voted for that measure?
So that was the total rescission bill. And that total rescission bill included the funding for this year, which a certain amount of that funding had already been baked in for 2026. And then they brought in an additional 1%, again, trying to balance the budget. Some of the revenues that have come in this year are not meeting some of the demands that were out there. And so there had to be some cuts to make sure everything was balanced. So I certainly supported that balanced budget. And then going into next year, there were a number of cuts as well, but that we haven't voted on all those yet. So what we voted on was the main rescission bill, which was for 2026, to make sure that we end up with a balanced budget, to make sure that our expenditures match our revenues. So we talked about the rescission bill that was passed for 2026. Now we're also voting on all the budgets for 2027. And there are a number of those budgets that have baked in, 3 to 5% cuts. And one of the biggest expenditure that we have, that bill was through the Senate yesterday, 1375. That's the Health and Human Service Maintenance Appropriation Budget. That is just under a $6 billion budget, the number one expenditure that we have. That, I think, has the most focus from a budget standpoint, because there were a number of programs that were threatened by the cuts in this budget. So a 5% cut in this budget can be pretty significant when you're dealing with $6 billion. And that's what they were looking at, is approximately about a 5% cut, 4.8%. And a lot of input that we've been receiving on that budget, and to some of the effects that we have. Now, that bill went through the Senate yesterday, and I think it might have passed, except Senator Guthrie got up on the floor and made a pretty impassioned plea. And his impassioned plea was, we're making these cuts when we really don't have to in 2027. And I certainly recommend, if any listeners want to hear, what a statesman is, they might want to pull up and listen to Senator Guthrie's speech yesterday. And after his speech, a number of senators rose up and they stopped and they killed that budget. And it has to go back now and be redone. And so I just think that in my short time here, Senator Guthrie is certainly probably one of the finest statesmen I think that we have here. And if you want to look at somebody that is a true leader, I think that he is. So he's pretty impressive. And that's a real interesting. That was the number one budget I think that people were most concerned about having cuts. And so I just wanted to mention that one. If you're interested, look into what Senator Guthrie did for that bill.
Absolutely. And just kind of on that topic and based off of kind of that hearing, obviously that budget will be changed now and has to be resubmitted. But what's your perspective specifically on the health and welfare budget and what either cuts or lack of cuts do you think should be made or how should that budget be adjusted in your opinion?
Well, I think what Senator Guthrie's point was is that there is money coming in, that we don't necessarily have as big a hole, and that some of these programs can still be funded, and that we can look at that a little bit differently, that we can be a little bit smarter and minimize those impacts a little bit better. He certainly wanted a more critical eye and critical look at that. And and I certainly, I'm not on JFAC and can't look through, I haven't looked through all those things, but I certainly agreed with that there's probably, some more work that can go into that. It's such a difficult thing when you look at some of the biggest issues that we have and the biggest costs that we have with health and welfare. And so I understand that, we need to keep that under control, but we're not increasing it. So I think Senator Guthrie's words are pretty valid.
And based off of that, I know that the budget's been a major focus, but is there anything else that you're working on or any other priorities that you've been focusing on this session?
All right, thanks. To get to that one, the committee that I'm worked the hardest in, I think, is education. And that education committee, I will admit that there is a tone over in this legislature that is pretty anti-public education. And there's a number of bills that come through that education committee that are fairly punitive to regular district brick and mortar public education. And those are some concerns I have in watching that. In our education committee, there have been a number of proposals that come through that we've been able to stop in committee. And some of these things, I think it's good that we got them stopped. Also trying to make sure that we get things funded correctly. As part of the budget, there are some pretty significant bills coming through to eliminate things. One of the things called IDLA, Idaho Digital Learning Academy. Idaho Digital Learning Academy is the state's online school offering that is used very, very extensively, especially in rural districts, where you have a small rural district that might not have all of the ability to teach some of these subjects because they just simply don't have the breadth of teachers. They're not going to be able to teach a German class or a physics class because they just don't have those instructors. Well, this is what that online program does for you. Well, there's a lot of cuts coming into that. For example, there's one proposal to completely eliminate the online digital academy and digital learning academy. We stopped that one in committee, but there's still a couple others that made hearings in committee to significantly reduce that funding. I think that's pretty critical. I think that's used extensively in our state, and I'm still watching that pretty closely, and we'll still fight to maintain the Idaho Digital Learning Academy. So that's something from an education standpoint we've been watching. And then in addition to it, I've been working on a couple other bills there. I've been working with the Department of Ed on a school strategic planning bill. And that strategic planning bill is a different way in which school districts can now do planning and set goals into the future. And following this methodology, it can give them additional flexibility on how to do that, removing some additional reports. That was a fair amount of work to put that together and get everybody on board with that, including superintendents, the Department of Ed, the Idaho Superintendents Associations, and worked quite extensively to get that bill where it's at. That's coming through the Senate, and then hopefully we will introduce that in the House next week. Also worked on some bills to provide flexible funding for school districts as well as charters. And I think we have some fabulous charter schools here in the state. And what happens is these charters do really, really well, but they have a lot more autonomy to do things. And my goal is to try and make school districts have some of that autonomy as well, because I think it provides innovation, and that freedom will produce better results. So those are some things that I've certainly been working on in education, kind of a defensive strategy, but also a few things to reduce some regulations and provide more ability for Idaho school districts to also succeed.
And I know that you've talked a lot about this being your first time in the legislature, and that you've been working through a lot of your priorities and on certain committees. I also so you recently filed for re-election. Can you tell us your plans for re-election and what you're hoping to campaign on and achieve in a hopeful second term?
Yes, and so just one thing is, when I say the word re-election, it certainly causes certain people to get triggers them a little bit, because theoretically I wasn't elected, I was appointed. And
Sure.
so this will be my first election that I'm working on. And yes, my plans are to try again for this seat, and hopefully convince the voters that I'm out here doing the work, that I'm here to represent them and represent their interests. Certainly the interests and the things that matter to me. We've talked about education. That's something that's very important to me. Another thing that I'm very, very concerned about preserving is, growing up in Soda Springs and in Rexburg, the outdoors is a huge part of my life. And what I do in the outdoors, the hunting and the fishing and things like that, I care about public lands, access to public lands, ensuring our hunting and fishing and things like that, and also utilizing those public lands for the resources. That's something I'm very interested in maintaining. I care about certain industries in Idaho that are unique to Idaho. Idaho, what we do out the INL, there's something out there for spent fuel reprocessing that can be an absolute gold mine for Idaho. I care about phosphate mining in our neck of the woods, because that is a unique and critical element that we absolutely need, versus turning another resource over to someone in China or for something, for example, and things like Micron. These are unique industries that I really want to see succeed. And then also, I do care about fiscal discipline. I do care about making sure we have a balanced budget. If we don't bring in enough revenue, we have to be very, very prescriptive in what we do to make sure our budget stays balanced. We gave a lot of tax cuts in 2026, a lot of tax cuts. And, that can be very easily argued whether there were too many tax cuts. But once you've done that, then you've got to balance the budget. And also, from a fiscal responsibility standpoint, I do not believe that turning over state taxes, i.e., eliminating state tax and then just dumping these costs onto cities and counties, is really a tax cut, because then what you've done is just put a burden onto cities and counties that they have to go and pull that revenue as well. So your pocketbook doesn't care if it's property tax, state tax, or federal tax, or sales tax. So putting taxes onto the county, that I don't consider that fiscal discipline either. So I think you need to look at that comprehensively. Those are the four areas that I really, really care about.
And thank you so much, Representative Veile, for joining us today. I just have one more question for you. So what would you say is the best way for your constituents and the everyday Idaho citizen to be involved in the legislative process?
I think certainly we get a lot of comments on emails and things like that. It is challenging to understand the nuances on why you would take a vote one way or the other. And, you certainly go to the Idaho legislature website, and there's just a host of bills, just an absolute number of bills that it's just impossible for everybody to stay on top of. So, I would recommend that people, what are the things that really, really matter to them, and follow those things. If you care about education, follow what goes on the education committee. If you care about health and welfare and things like those services, follow what goes on in health and welfare committee or agriculture committee and things like that. I think try and see what goes on there, and then try and contact your representatives with what matters to you. Getting your input does matter. And I'll say that getting your input from your constituents matter a significant amount as well. So that's what I look for. When I get that input from my constituents that are actually in my district, that really makes a lot more difference to me than if it's an email that comes out of Boise or something. So if I see something coming out of Montpelier or Victor or McCammon, that matters to me. So try and follow what matters most to you, because it's probably pretty tough to follow everything. I know I have a hard time with it, and I spend 12 hours a day at it. So that's my recommendation there. Well, thank you, Simon. One other thing that I'm working on, I've been working with Representative Stephanie Mickelson out of Idaho Falls and Representative Dan Garner, and he's out of the Preston area. Great people. I really enjoy working with them. And what we're working on is a large electrical load bill that keeps it so that new large electrical loads on the system cannot socialize their costs. And what that means, if you, for example, put in a large data center, which can use significant amounts of power, okay, one data center could use the entire power of Southeast Idaho. We don't want those costs to supply that load to go to other ratepayers. Now, the Public Utility Commission does a pretty good job in their rate making to prevent that. We are trying to codify that language because we see it as something that is coming down that could happen more and more with the proliferation of data centers and these large loads. So we've been working, as a matter of fact, that's the number one thing that we worked on this week, is negotiating with the power companies, negotiating with large customers in the state of Idaho to get language to help protect that. And I will say that I got a text here just about 20 minutes ago where I think everybody's on board with the language we have. And so we're hoping to run that next week. Again, this is a protection so that large electrical loads do not socialize their costs to other ratepayers. That doesn't mean that electricity rates won't go up. They go up because of other factors. We just don't want ratepayers subsidizing new large electrical loads. And so that's a new bill that we're hoping to get introduced Monday or Tuesday. And it's getting close to the end of the session, but we're still hoping to push that one through to provide those protections.